Good to be here. And about 6 years ago, 7 years ago, I really started digging into Genesis 1. And I know a lot of what I'll probably present you with tonight might be things maybe you haven't thought of before. I know I have a little different take on this than a lot of people do, which was a little bit scary. I got to admit, Curtis, because I don't know, what you expect, but I can tell you what I've learned, what I think. And I don't expect everybody to agree with me necessarily on this. It's an interesting and fascinating idea as we get into creation, we get into Genesis. It's something that, I guess from the time I was a young kid, I've heard it. We grew up in this scientific age, right? When I was a kid, it was all about science, and science was going to fix everything, and science was going to cure everything. And if you're my age, I remember sitting in school, we'd watch films of planes changing the weather, and the idea was that science had the answers to everything, and that the world was going to be great because we had it all figured out. And now we don't, right? And so we hear all these things about creation and about time and about 7 literal days or 7 ages, or it's just fascinating what we try to do, because it seems like as people, as Christians, we try to fit the Bible into science. We try to fit it into what we hear. If scientists say, well, the Earth's millions of years old, then we think, well, how can that be? So let's make the text do that. And so we get these ideas, day-age theories, and all these other things. And then on the other side, we're saying, well, science has got to be wrong, and the Bible's right. So the Earth's only 15,000 years old. So if you go to the Creation Museum, or you go out to Noah's Ark out in Kentucky, Tennessee, we've been out there. Really fascinating to go through that, see Ham's interpretation of how that happened, and how time transpired, and how we have a young Earth, and how the Ark worked, and how God brought everything over, and how all this worked out. And he's got this magnificent Ark built, and this magnificent displays and interpretation of that, and you can go through that and look at that. But if we kind of set that aside tonight a little bit, and let's just kind of look at the text, and we're going to kind of talk about viewing the world, viewing it the way that the people it was written to viewed it. And when I really started doing that, it really changed how I viewed Genesis. Genesis is a really old book, right? We really don't know. Most people think 13th to 15th century BC. Some people think maybe it was written a lot later than that. Some people don't give it to Moses. There's a tremendous amount of debate about it. But either way you look at it, it's an ancient text written to an ancient people in an ancient language. And that's fascinating to me. I love the idea of that. But God has always chosen to speak to man through men, right? He's always chosen to speak to us through men. Now, I understand the Bible is inspired by the Holy Spirit, and I'm not arguing that. But what I'm saying is that God has always chosen to say, Moses, write this, right? Paul, write this. Peter, write this. Luke, write this. He's never came to me and said, I'm just going to give it to you, or to you and say, I'm going to give it to you. God's always chosen to communicate through a person. And so we have to have integrity in that guy that's giving that to us, whoever that might be, whether it's Moses or whether it's Peter or Paul or whoever it is that's writing to us. We have to understand there's an integrity between God and that author. And that author is presenting to us what God would have him to present. Now, in the Bible, we always have to kind of ask this question. Was it written to us, or was it written for us? You see? It's really important to understand that. Because if I'm a person in the days of Moses, when Moses writes Genesis, or I'm in that time frame, God really wrote that text to me. I really understand it. They would understand it. It made a lot more sense to them. They lived in that world. They lived in that reality. It just made more sense. It's just like when Paul would write or Peter would write. We read the book of Revelation. We sometimes struggle with the book of Revelation. And I would dare say that the 7 churches of Asia that John actually wrote Revelation to, I would dare say they understood that book a whole lot better than we do. Because it was written to them. It was addressed to them. It was their time. It was their book. They understood that. You and I, we don't live in that time. We don't live in Asia Minor. We don't dwell in those churches. We don't experience those problems. We don't live under the influence of Rome. Even though we can try to put ourselves there, we're still not there. And what I'm trying to get at here is there's low context and high context when we talk about authors and we talk about people that read that. And I think really the best illustration with that would be, when my kids send me text messages, right? I mean, they're really high context. They send me all these, I don't know what they are. They send me all these abbreviations and stuff. And I have to text them back, and I'm like, what does that mean, right? I mean, I'm low context, To them, it all makes sense. They can text each other all these little LOLs and YOLOs and all this different stuff, and that all makes good sense to them. But to me, I got to have it explained to me because I'm not high context. And it's the same way in the Bible. When we are not a high context audience, it's hard for us. We struggle because we have to try to put ourselves back into their place, back into what they were and what they were thinking and what the world meant to them. Not what it means to me, but what does it mean to them? How did they view the world? How did they view creation? How did they view God? What did they really want? What did they really want to get out of the book of Genesis? I promise you, they didn't want to get out of Genesis what we want to get out of Genesis. I promise you. They were not looking at Genesis to get out of it what we want. They weren't looking at Genesis with the idea, well, I need to explain millions of years of age of earth. I need to explain creation. I need to explain what God. That wasn't what they wanted out of that book. We do, but that's not what they wanted. So we have to ask ourselves, was it written to us or for us? What was it really written to us? I didn't live then. I didn't live in that society. But it was written for us. It was written for us, for I could understand it, so I could do something. And so I have to ask myself, am I a high context audience or a low context audience when it comes to Genesis? And the answer is plain. I'm low context when it comes to Genesis. I'll be honest, I'm low context with a lot of the Bible. I mean, I'm just being 100% honest. I've had conversations with rabbis because I'm low context when it comes to Judaism. I understand the precept of Judaism. I understand what it is. But when Jesus is talking to Jews and they're talking about Jewish things and Jewish customs and Jewish traditions and temple things, I'm low context. I never lived in that time. I don't know what it's like to go sacrifice an animal. I don't know what that entails. I don't know what it's like to walk into the temple and see the money changing temples. I don't know. I mean, I read it, but truth is, I really don't know what that's like. I don't know what it smelled like. I don't know what it felt like. I don't know what it tasted like. I don't know. I'm low context. So I go to a rabbi. I love to talk to rabbis. I talk to rabbis about Jewish things. I say, explain to me Jewish things. Explain to me what you think about the temple. Explain to me what you think about sacrifice. Explain to me what you think about Passover. Because I don't know. I'm low context. I want to know. I want to be able to sit in that seat and think, I can really understand this. But I know I have to catch up. And so that's what we got to do with Genesis. We got to catch up. We got to catch up a little bit. We need to understand we're low context. We need to view the world as they viewed the world. And we're going to talk about that a little bit. And I'm glad we got a little time because it's kind of interesting. We need to view the world how they viewed it, not how you and I view it. We sometimes look at the Bible as a scientific text. I'm not a scientist. I'm a mechanic. I'm a preacher. I'm not a scientist. I don't understand science that well. I've had some classes. I'm not a scientist. But I promise you, there's no new science in the Bible. The Bible is not a scientific text. God doesn't want, and we're going to talk about this. I hope I can really explain this and bring this out. God's not trying to explain the universe to us. God's not trying to explain physiology to us. God's not trying to explain any of that stuff to us. Because that's not the purpose of the Bible. It's not why it was written. It's not the point. And I'm going to try to illustrate that a little bit, if you'll bear with me. God's not a science teacher. Not a science teacher. And I'm going to illustrate that with some ideas that I hope kind of help that to make sense. Because if I told you, in your mind, I said, what's the earth look like? And in your mind right now, you're probably seeing this, right? Because that's our earth. Am I right? That's our earth. Now, I've never seen this, never been into space, but I'm taking somebody's word for it that they've been there, and they've taken the picture, and this is where we live. Right? What if you never saw that? What if nobody had ever went into space and ever took a picture, and you had no idea this is what it looked like? Try to work with me for a minute. So all you knew is what you could see. When you walked out your door, you saw the sun come up, you saw the sun go down, you saw the moon come up and down. So was the earth moving? Or are the planets moving? You know, right? What's beyond the next hilltop? What's beyond the next valley? You see, we're really high context when it comes to science, aren't we? We have all this great science. We got all this great weather. We know what's going on. We know it's going to rain before it rains. And I think, man, that's marvelous. You know, I talked to some people I know. Well, matter of fact, I'm thinking about Larry and Pat. I'm thinking about Junior. You know, Junior Bailey, he would always say, he said, boy, when I was a kid, I'd go to school and I'd ride my horse to school. And he'd say, man, we'd never know. You know, we might come out in a tornado. We might come out in a snowstorm. We might come out in hail. We didn't have a clue. You know, there wasn't no weather. There wasn't anything to watch. You know, people would say, oh, well, the cows are turning tails to the fence, or the persimmons got spoons, or whatever, because that's all they knew, right? They didn't know anything else. And we just take that for granted, you see. But this is our earth. But now, pretend you don't know that. Pretend that you don't have a clue that that's what it is. In Job, it says, who shakes the earth out of its place, and its pillars tremble? Does the earth set on pillars? Do you think? No, I don't think so. I mean, obviously, I think the earth is this ball, right? But when God's talking to Job, and he says, who makes the pillars? In Psalm 75, it says, the earth and all who dwell in it melt. It is I who have firmly set its pillars. You see, they didn't know your earth, okay? What they knew was this. This is the earth of the Old Testament. This is what they knew. This is what it was. It was flat. It was on pillars. It had Sheol underneath that was damp and dark, and that was the dead. And it had a firmament, and it had a dome on top that went across this top, and there were waters above and waters below. You read Genesis? He separated the waters above from the waters below. That made perfect sense to them. When I read that, I'm like, what does that mean? Right? But to them, it made perfect sense, because even the Egyptians and their gods, they had the sky god that was above, the goddess that was stretched above the earth, and they had the earth god underneath, and then they had the air god in the middle, because the sky god and the earth god were married, and the air god kept them apart. I mean, it wasn't just the Hebrews. Now, the difference between Hebrew and Egyptian, Mesopotamian, was that in Egyptian or Mesopotamian view of the earth, it was all full of gods. You had a sky god, you had an earth god, you had an air god in the middle of this. You had all these different gods. But in the Hebrew, because the Hebrews know, right? Hear, O Israel, the Lord your God, the Lord is one. In the Hebrew view, this was their earth. And there were doors in the top of that that let the rain, these floodgates that would let the rain come down, so you would have rain, and the earth was supported with these pillars, and there was a firmament on high, and God was above that. And we hear about Paul, right? The third heaven. I caught up into the third heaven. Why does Paul say that? Because it made perfect sense to them. The first heaven is the air we breathe. The second heaven is the sky we see. The third heaven is above that firmament. It's where God dwells. The third heaven. You and I read that, we go, what does that mean? But it made perfect sense to them. And so they had this view of the world. And the reason I brought up Job is because God tells Job this. God's fine with Job believing the earth is flat. God never goes to Job and says, now, Job, sit down here and I'll tell you something. You've got this all wrong. The earth is round. The earth's not flat. There's no pillars on the earth. Why doesn't God tell him that? Because it doesn't matter. It makes no difference. God's not writing Job to explain to him science. God's writing Job to explain to him, I did this. I'm in control. I handle this. You know, if you read Job, he says, the storehouses of snow. That made perfect sense to them. You and I know snow isn't stored in storehouses, right? We know that. We know snow. We understand weather, right? But Job, it made perfect sense when Job says the storehouses of snow, because they thought the snow was in these storehouses, in these gates above this firmament, and that the snow came in. So God doesn't say, let me teach you science. Let me teach you how the earth really looks. God doesn't care. It doesn't make any difference. Because the message to Job is not, I need to teach you the earth. The message to Job is, I need to tell you I'm in control of it. Whatever earth you think, whatever you think it looks like is irrelevant to me. I'm in control. So we have to ask ourselves, what's the message of the Bible? What's the message of creation? In Isaiah, it says, it is he who sits above the circle of the earth. And people, you hear this all the time. You get on the internet, about science. So the Bible says that the earth's round. Look at Isaiah. Look at the book of Isaiah. It's plain. God says that it's a circle of the earth. Isaiah 40. Hebrew word, disc, flat. God never said it was round like a ball. He said it was a disc. God never says, let me tell you what the earth looks like. God says, I don't care what you think the earth looks like. As long as you understand I'm in control of it, it doesn't make any difference. So many times we look to the Bible and we try to back up science. Why? The Bible's not about science. The Bible's not about that. And so when we look at that in Psalms 139, you formed my inward parts. You wove me in my mother's womb. So now that we know that we've got pictures, don't we? We know that egg gets fertilized, and we see that cell divide, and you've probably seen those pictures, you've seen those videos, and we know how it works. It doesn't change this. God still woves us together, and our mother's still God. You know what I'm saying? It doesn't matter. God didn't come to David and say, David, I'm going to explain to you that's not really how it works. You see, there's this egg, and there's a sperm, and it fertilizes the egg, and the egg divides. God, why does it matter? God does it. Doesn't matter how he does it. God does it. So sometimes we try to look and we're like, what is it? What does it mean? What's David trying to say? In Matthew, and I think this is really interesting because I love this passage, and it says, it's where Jesus is the lame man. And of course, in Judaism, they think, sin and disease, sin and sickness are the same thing. If you're sick, you sin. Think about the man born blind. And it wasn't about the blind guy, right? They went by and the apostles said, who sinned, this man or his parents? To them, sin and physical ailment was one and the same thing. That was your punishment. If you sinned, there was punishment. And that punishment was physical ailment, poverty, whatever it might be. That was your punishment. And Jesus, when he's healing this man, it's really funny because I just look at Jesus and I'm like, and it's almost like saying, I don't care. I'm not going to explain to you what it means to heal this guy. If you think it means his sins are forgiven, I'm good with that. If you think it means I just healed him, take up your bed and walk, I'm good with that too. I'm not going to explain it to you. I'm not going to debate it with you. I'm just going to say, which is easier for me to say? Because to you, it's the same thing. Your sins are forgiven, take up your bed and walk. I mean, Jesus understood the man's sins. I mean, Jesus said, he said, you know, the ones that the tower fell on, were they greater sinners than anyone in Jerusalem? No. Jesus understood that it wasn't the sin of the man, but he wasn't going to argue with him. He wasn't going to explain it to him because it didn't matter. It didn't matter. He says, I've healed this man. Make out of it what you will. If you want to say your sins, I forgive his sins and he's made well, then I'm good. If you want to say, well, he just healed him and he's well, I'm good with that too. Doesn't back up, doesn't try to explain it, doesn't try to make that happen. He just simply does it. I think another, and I didn't really put much on there about this, but I think another thing that's really interesting in the Old Testament is the word for mind or heart. You know, in Deuteronomy it says, you shall love the God with all your heart, with all your soul, with all your might. And translators really help us with that idea, mind. Do you realize it wasn't until the last few centuries that we even knew that this was our mind? We didn't know this. We thought this was nothing. We thought, matter of fact, there was a point, who was that? I can't remember, who said this was a radiator for our blood, right? In the ancient world, this up here didn't do anything. It was worthless. When Egyptians would mummify somebody, they would take out all your organs. They'd put them all in jars. What about your brain? Put a hook in there, drag it out, throw it away. Didn't mean anything. Wasn't worth anything. You know, if you've heard the saying, you live in Oklahoma, we say, I've got a gut feeling. You ever say that? I've got a gut feeling about that. Well, in the Old Testament, guess what the word for mind was, or heart? It was intestine. It was intestine. That's actually the Hebrew word for that. It's intestine. I think because that's where they thought this is where we think. This is our center of our being, is down here in our gut. And that kind of makes sense if you didn't know science, because how many of you, when you get really upset or you get really perplexed, does your head hurt or does your stomach hurt? Right? Your stomach hurts. And if you don't have any science, what do you think? You think, this is it. This is my problem, right? This is where I think. It's down here. I think with my gut. And that's stuck around, and that's why we say, well, I got a gut feeling about that, right? That's why we say that. God didn't come to the Hebrews throughout all the Old Testament and say, listen, I'm going to explain to you that you really think up here. You don't think down here. You really think up here. You've got this wrong. Let me explain to you how this works. God says, don't care. Don't care. Doesn't matter. If you think up here, if you think down here, what difference is it to me? God's not a science teacher. Over and over, we see that reality. The other thing we really have to think about in Genesis, we really have to think about when we talk about the Old Testament, is cause and effect. In the ancient world, it was real simple. If something happened, God did it. Simple. There wasn't any other reason. In a world of polytheists, where they believe in multiple gods, it was real simple. Read Greek mythology, read Roman mythology, read Egyptian theology, right? Mythology. It all comes down to there's a God for everything. There's a God for weather. There's a God for pain. There's a God for birth. There's a God for health. There's a God for everything. And if anything happens, it's a God. A God did it. Real simple. You and me don't think like that anymore, do we? In Jesus' day, if somebody threw themselves down on the ground and went into convulsions, what's the first thing they thought? Got a demon, right? If somebody fell down in this auditorium right this second, fell down in this floor and started going into convulsions, what would you think? You think he's having a seizure. Call 911. We need to get this guy some medical help right now. People in the time of Jesus didn't think that. They thought, he's got a demon. Now, I'm not saying demons didn't exist, because I know that the Bible says they did. but I'm telling you that they didn't make that distinction. All right? Cause and effect is a really big thing for you and me. We understand that. We know it rains because of the weather. We know that the wind blows. When Nicodemus came to Jesus and Jesus says the wind blows and you don't know where it goes. That was perfect, wasn't it? Now to me and you, we think, well, I know there's a high pressure, there's a low pressure center, and Kansas is blowing up there and it's blowing right through here towards Texas, We would think, we know. But when Jesus went to Nicodemus and said, you don't know where the wind blows. No, I don't. Don't understand any of it. I just know I feel it. I don't know where it's going. I don't know where it came from. You see, and that's a big thing for them. What's cause and effect? What makes things happen? What happens? And in the Old Testament, it was just so clear. It's God. And I want to share with you a passage. I'm going to get to Genesis, I promise. I'm going to get to Genesis. But I want to share you a passage out of Job. Because Job has all these, Job 1. Job has all these terrible things happen to him, right? I mean, he loses everything. Loses his house, loses his family, loses his wealth, loses his cattle, loses everything. And at the end of this, it's just such a fascinating passage. Because you and I, we're like Satan and God. And that's really this idea of good versus evil and what's bad and what's good. But Job, old ancient Job, right? Job says it's God, right? Job says, naked I came from my mother's womb, and naked I shall return. The Lord gave, and the Lord has taken away. Isn't it funny? Job didn't say, well, look what Satan did. Right? He said, the Lord gave, and the Lord took it away. In other words, what's his cause and effect? It's real simple. God did it. Because that's how you think. That's how you would think. If you don't know how the weather works and there's a drought, God's punishing us. Right? If we have a bountiful crop, God's blessing us. It's all God. You see? You and me, we don't think like that. When there's a drought, we think, well, it's La Nina or El Nino or whatever it is these days, or it's global warming, or it's something happening in Africa, low pressure front, You know what I'm saying? We don't look at it and say, well, God's punishing us. It hasn't rained in a month. God's punishing us. I don't think there's any of us in here that think like that. But they did. Certainly they did. What would you think? What would you think? Look at the ancient world. Look at ancient religions, not just Judaism or Christianity, but look at Mayan religion. Look at Egyptian religion. Look at Mesopotamian religion. Everything they did was about appeasing the gods, right? Making the gods happy. If you couldn't get pregnant, you needed to go to the god of fertility. It was Artemis, right? Artemis in the New Testament. She was the goddess of fertility, right? We went to Italy, and literally every corner there's a temple. Every corner there's a temple. You just can't believe how many temples. I've never been there. I've never been there in my life. I knew there were temples. Okay, I knew that. I mean, I knew the Apocrypha. I mean, I knew there was stuff there. But we went to the Isle of Delos. We went to these ruins in Delos. There's like 43 temples on the Isle of Delos. There's temples to Zeus. There's temples to Aphrodite. There's temples to Samson. There's to gods I don't even know. Everywhere there's a temple. Everywhere there's a temple. Because everything to them was about a god. And that's how they thought. So when we start thinking, and I'm just trying to get us thinking in that mindset, but we know God created. I'm good with that. I have no issue with that. I 100% with all my being, all my fiber, everything that's within me, I know that God created what we see from what we don't see. I have no issue with that. I believe that with every fiber that I have. But I don't know that that's what we're talking about in Genesis 1. And that's what we really need to think about a little bit. What is Genesis 1 really about? What is God really wanting to tell us? What's he really wanting to tell them when he's writing Genesis? What's he really wanting us to see? What's God really wanting us to see? Because we have to ask ourselves, whose science are we talking about? I'm 59 years old. And I promise you, the science when I was a child is not the science that we have today. Promise you. And I will promise you, in 50 years, the science that we have today will not be the science they have in 50 years. I promise. It's not going to happen. No way. Because it's always changing, it's always going, it's always something different. They thought it was all God. We think it's all nature. We think it's all science. Right? You know, when Darwin wrote his Evolution of Species, when Darwin wrote that, and Darwin looked at that slime, and he said, well, come out of the slime because this slime's just slime. And it wasn't very many years later than that, we got an electron microscope, we looked at the slime, right? And we said, slime's not slime anymore. Slime is amazingly complex with DNA and all these other things that we had no idea. And so now science has decided that, well, slime is too complex to just happen. So now we got to have intelligent design. We're not going to call it God yet, but now we got to have intelligent design because it's too complicated. But when Darwin looked at it, he goes, this is just goo. Right? And we all came out of the school. So science changed, didn't it? Science has changed. And now our schools who went from teaching evolution and went from teaching this Darwinism idea, English is my first language, I promise you. They went to teaching this idea of intelligent design now, right? We're going to put intelligent design. We're not going to call it God. Heaven forbid we'd call it God, right? But we're going to say it's intelligent design, that we had to be a designer. Now, science changes. And to try to reconstruct creation of the universe from Genesis 1 would be like trying to reconstruct the human anatomy from a Picasso. You know? I mean, that's all the pieces, more or less. Right? But if I was to show somebody that picture and said, that's a woman. Right? It just wouldn't jive, would it? Just would, because it's missing. There's stuff missing, isn't there? Picasso didn't want us to see that woman. He wanted us to see whatever he wanted us to see. I'm not sure what that is because I'm not really into that. But we can't do it. So in Genesis 1, let's read that text. It says, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Oh, we'll find that. The earth was formless and void, and the darkness was over the surface of the deep, and the Spirit of God was moving over the surface of the waters. Then God said, let there be light, and there was light. God saw the light was good, and God separated the light from the darkness, and God called the light day, and the darkness he called night, and there was evening, and there was morning one day. Then God said, let there be an expanse in the midst of the waters, let it separate the waters from the waters. And God made the expanse and separated the waters which were below. Oh, went too far. And separated the waters which were below the expanse from the waters above the expanse, and it was so. And I hope when I read that right there, you're looking at their view of the world, and that already looks different to you than it did any time you've ever read it before in your life. Because now it really makes sense, because that's exactly how they thought this worked, right? Exactly how they thought this worked. And then God said, let the waters and heavens be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear. And it was so. And God called the dry land earth, and the gathering of the waters he called seas. And God saw that it was good. God said, let the earth sprout vegetation, plants yielding seed, and fruit trees on the earth bearing fruit after their kind, with seed in them. It was so. The earth brought forth vegetation, plants yielding seed after their kind, the trees bearing fruit with seed in them, and after their kind. And God said that it was good. And there was evening and morning, the third day. So I'd ask you a question. If you could go back with me tonight and try to put yourself centuries ahead of where you're at right now, and try to forget that you know about science, try to forget that somebody has told you the earth is millions and billions of years old, and you really don't understand the universe, and there's no Hubble telescope, and you've never been to space, right? Nobody's ever walked on the moon. All you've seen is what's outside of your front door. You've never saw a television set or heard a radio broadcast in your life. Never. And you're presented with Genesis 1. What do you think it would mean to you? That's a question I had to ask myself. What would it mean to me if I didn't know what I know? And that's hard to do. Because the truth is, I do know what I know, right? And as Christians, we need to take a break. I'm going to have to hurry up. Okay. All right. Ring that bell. We'll get it cooked.